Hi, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. As many of you know, my new book, The War on Science, is appearing July 29th of this year in the United States and Canada. And to celebrate that, we've interviewed many of the authors, of the 39 authors who have contributed to this volume. And we have 20 separate podcast interviews that will be airing over the next 20 days, starting July 22nd, before and after the book first appears, with many of the authors in the book on a host of different subjects. The authors we will have interviews with in order of appearance over the next 20 days are Richard Dawkins, Niall Ferguson, Nicholas Christakis, Maarten Boudry, Abigail Thompson, John Armstrong, Sally Satel, Solveig and Joshua Katz, Francis Widdowson, Carole Hooven, Janice Fiamengo, Geoff Horsman, Alessandro Strumia, Roger Cohen and Amy Wax, Peter Boghossian, Lauren Schwartz and Arthur Rousseau, Alex Byrne and Moti Gorin, Judith Sisa and Alice Sullivan, Carleen Gribble, and finally Dorian Abbott. The topics that will be discussed will range over the need for free speech and open inquiry in science and the need to preserve scientific integrity, stressed by our first podcast interviewee, Richard Dawkins, and we'll once again go over historical examples of how academia has been hijacked by ideology in the past and the negative consequences that have come from that, to issues of how specific disciplines, including mathematics, have been distorted, and how certain departments at universities now specifically claim that they are social activists, and a degree in their field is a degree in either critical social justice or social activism, not a degree in a specific area of scholarship, how ideology has permeated universities. We'll proceed also to discuss issues in medicine. Sally Satel will talk about how social justice has hijacked medicine. And also, when it comes to issues of gender-affirming care, we have a variety of authors who are going to speak about the issues there and how too often gender-affirming care claims are made that are not based on empirical evidence, in fact, falsely discuss the literature in ways that are harmful to young people. We'll talk to several people who, for one reason or another, have been canceled for saying things. Francis Widdowson at Mount Royal University in Canada, and Carole Hooven from Harvard, who eventually had to leave Harvard after saying on television that sex is binary in biology. We'll be talking to people who've looking at the impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion in academia and how it's restricting free inquiry and also restricting, in many ways, scientific merit at those universities. And finally, Dorian Abbott, the last contributor to our series, will be talking about 3 principles he believes are essential to separate science and politics and keep academia free from ideology and more for open questioning and progress, and to make sure that science is based on empirical evidence, and where we go where the evidence is, whether it's convenient or not, whether it's politically correct or not, and we're willing to debate all ideas that nothing is sacred, a central feature of what science should be about and what, in some sense, this podcast is about. So I hope you really enjoy the next 20 days, and we've enjoyed bringing it to you. So with no further ado, The War on Science, the interviews. Well, Maarten Boudry, it's nice to see you again. It's been quite a while since we were together last, over in your end of the woods, right?
That's right. You were in Ghent twice, if I recall, for 2 debates. I think they're still on YouTube. The one with the late Dan Dennett, and then more recently, I think the one with Dawkins was only a couple of years ago in Antwerp, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, it was more than a couple of years ago. I think the one in Antwerp was right after the Charlie Hebdo shootings in Paris.
That's right. Yeah, then it was 2016, 2015. That's
What?
Is that 2015 or 16? Or
I
that's
have
already
no
a
idea.
decade.
It's probably a decade ago. Yeah, it's hard to believe.
Yeah.
Well, look, I know you moderated a discussion on philosophy where I was outnumbered with two philosophers.
That's right.
And you're a philosopher yourself, and the point of this discussion is to talk about your contribution to the book, The War on Science. But this is the Origins podcast, and I like to find out how people got to where they are. First, what got you interested in philosophy, and then, as a philosopher, what got you interested in this question of the current climate in academia and attacks on free speech and rational inquiry. So let's start with philosophy. What got you into philosophy?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's probably a long and convoluted story that I'm not gonna
Give me the
that I'm not
executive
gonna relate.
summary.
Yeah, exactly. I think I couldn't really make up my mind when I wanted to, pick a subject. I was into music at first. I actually almost became a jazz pianist or composer.
I see your
And
piano behind you. Yeah.
that's true. I still play the piano. In some alternative universe, perhaps I'm a jazz piano player. But I think I've always been interested in just asking annoying questions, and that's one of the definitions of philosophy.
Philosophy,
Socrates as the gadfly, like the person who challenges, preconceived
Was it?
views or whatever. But then, of course, this is 20 years ago when I started studying philosophy, and when I did my PhD, that's already a little bit closer to this volume. I've always been interested in bullshit, irrationality, the foibles of human reasoning, and my PhD was about the difference between science and pseudoscience. And from there, I kind of broadened my scope into irrational belief systems, and then I started to be interested in religious fundamentalism. Of course, this is around like the wave of terrorist attacks that you already mentioned. And I guess that's how I, became interested in some irrational belief systems in academia. Some ideologies that have captured academia and that are also causing a lot of damage. So that's the short summary of how I ended up here.
So you went. I mean, yeah, it's true. When we were there with Richard, we were talking about religious ideology, and now or at least religion, and now in some sense we're talking about a kind of secular religion, and and it's there are many similarities. Although as I've often said, one of the differences between the secular religion and the regular religion, at least for Christianity, is that in Christianity, at least there's the concept of redemption. There doesn't seem to be that in the secular religion. But you start your let's go to your contribution called "The Tyranny of Victimhood: How Progressives Turn Regressive," and you begin with a quote from Orwell, which I'd never heard, but I'll read it. I kind of like it. "I had reduced everything to the simple theory that the oppressed are always right and the oppressors are always wrong. A mistaken theory, but the natural result of being one of the oppressors yourself," which is kind of interesting because, in fact, it's particularly appropriate because it's people from the West who ideally are, quote, the oppressors, who are basically saying that attacking the Western Enlightenment on which their whole system is based. But you begin I was kind of intrigued. You begin your contribution with a quote from former president of Harvard University, Claudine Day. You say it depends on context. Why don't you explain where that comes from and why you began with that?
Yeah, because these sound like sorry, I'm gonna say it again. These sound like innocent 4 words, like nothing wrong with that. But then, of course, you can apply the sentence to itself. It really does depend on the context because she was answering a question that was posed to her during the infamous hearing in the U.S. Congress about anti-Semitism on campuses, so Harvard and some other U.S. campuses. And what she was basically saying is that to call for the genocide of the Jews, so the extermination of the Jewish race, that it depends on the context whether or not you're allowed to say that. So Elise Stefanik, the Republican politician, asked her the question a number of times, and she kept repeating this kind of evasive and lawyerly phrase that she had probably rehearsed beforehand. And now it doesn't sound that innocent anymore, does it? Because of course, calling for the genocide of the Jews would only be problematic from her perspective if it's if it is carried over into action. And she defended her statement by saying that she's very committed to academic freedom and to freedom of speech in line of the First Amendment of the U.S., which of course is incredibly hypocritical, because if you look at the track record of Harvard University in the ranking of FIRE, the organization that is dedicated to academic freedom, I think Harvard's was dead last, or it was like the lowest score that they ever. Yeah, it was. So if only she had been consistent, then perhaps we could have an argument about whether or not, like, calling for the genocide of a particular people, falls under the First Amendment or not. But of course, the real problem with her quote is just the errant hypocrisy. I mean, people get canceled at Harvard University for using the wrong pronouns, or for making some inappropriate comment about somebody's weight. But then when it comes to the Jews, like, all bets are off. Like, everything goes. You can say whatever about the Jews, and this is really intriguing. I mean, this really struck me when I heard that, and of course I wanted to dig deeper and understand where this is coming from, because this has a huge, like, ideological background and a history that that goes back decades.
Yeah, I think Steven Pinker, who also contributes this volume, joked that gave a joke about some students saying, "Well, I have to leave this class on proper use of pronouns in order to go to the demonstration on kill all the Jews." And yeah, it does demonstrate the kind of the dichotomy. And as you point out, this is deep. It's not just a matter of anti-Semitism in this case. It's a deep-seated notion that has roots. And I was actually surprised, to give a sense of various departments in the humanities who sort of built up this ideological structure. You said no fewer than 120 departments of gender studies around the world felt compelled to condemn Israel in the wake of the largest anti-Semitic massacre since the Holocaust, but none of them had a single word to spare for the female victims of sexual violence by Hamas and other jihadist groups. Again, that kind of double think. You want to comment on that at all? Were you surprised?
I was surprised. I mean, this perhaps we have to go back to the 7th of October, because initially, when I heard the news of the terrorist attack, or the pogrom, or whatever you want to call it, I was not surprised, because, as I said, I have already been studying Islamic fundamentalism and jihadism for a while. Hamas is a jihadist death cult that is very comparable to Jabhat al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So, of course, if you give them an opportunity, they're going to rape and massacre and slaughter. But then what happened immediately afterwards was really surprising to me. I mean, surprising is a bit of an understatement. It was really, like, shocking.
It was shocking. Yeah.
Just the day afterwards, or even like a few hours after the event itself, you had students at Harvard University, for example, who immediately released a statement pinning all the blame of the massacre on the Jewish state. So basically saying that whatever Hamas was doing, some of them would condemn it, but basically it was all understandable as a reaction against the long history of oppression. So there's a whole range of reactions, of course, from, like, obfuscation to apologetics to sometimes, like, outright glorification. So there's, in some extreme examples, people were really, like, exhilarated. There was this one professor, and I'm not sure if it was at Harvard University, was basically saying that he was exhilarated by just the Gazans, or the Palestinians, finally breaking free from their open air prison. And that I didn't really see that coming. So I have to be honest, I kind of underestimated this thing. I was vaguely aware of the decolonization movement. I mean, it had reached me at my university as well, where people were saying, like, there's too many dead white males in the curriculum, so we have to become more inclusive. And I kind of, like, okay, I rolled my eyes, and I thought, like, whatever. I mean, this is just symbolic virtue signaling. There's nothing much at stake here. So I was not really, like, really like motivated to really read up on the ideological background of all these, like Frantz Fanon, for example. I'm really like
We'll
writing a
talk
lot,
about
like
him in
paying
a
a lot of
bit.
attention. Yeah, but all of this stuff I only read after the 7th of October, because then it suddenly dawned on me like, whoa, this is something like a volcano that is suddenly erupting that I had no idea about. I really have to read up on all this stuff, because this is really serious. It's not just about whatever, like decolonizing the curriculum. There's really something at stake here when 1,200 people are being brutally murdered by a terrorist group.
Yeah, and now you do go in your discussion to the intellectual roots of this. That this reaction in Israel is deeper roots, and you argue it. This ideology, the roots are complex, but the framework is easy to summarize, as you say. First, you divide the world up into two mutually exclusive categories: the oppressed and the oppressor. These two groups are locked in a zero-sum struggle where one group's gain can happen only at the expense of the other's loss. There can be no middle ground. Either you are an oppressor or a victim. And you say it's the dichotomy is between Western and non-Western. You want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I guess some people would say the distinction between good and evil, like this Manichaeist worldview, is of course much older than the Frantz Fanon and Edward Said and all these other authors. By the way, you mentioned George Orwell. It's interesting in its own right. This was written I think in the late 30s, The Road to Wigan-Pier. So it's you cannot all trace it back to postmodernism or post-colonialism. So this intuitive division of the world into innocent victims and evil oppressors, of course, props up in many different contexts and many different ideologies. But I think what is striking about this particular ideology is that you have an intersection of different dimensions of oppression. Famously, Jonathan Haidt has written about this, and a number of other people. And most of these divisions are about groups of people. You have white people versus black or non-white people. Then you have the cisgender versus gender, etc. So where it's as if you have a cake that is sliced up in along different dimensions in different ways. But I think the what is unique about this ideology is that the one overarching dimension of oppression is not really about a type of person at all. It's about a civilization. It's Western versus non-Western. So the reason I think why Israel is in the crosshairs of this ideology is not so much because it's the only Jewish state in the world, although of course that also contributes to the hatred. But I think it is really when we're trying to explain the hatred of Israel among Western progressives, of course. It's a whole different story when we're talking about Hamas and Hezbollah, etc. But when it comes to Western progressives, I don't really directly accuse them of anti-Semitism. What I think is happening is that they see Israel as a proxy of Western civilization. And because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that's how they end up as strange bedfellows as Hamas. And that's not because of some ideological affinity. It's because Israel is indeed, it is an outpost of Western civilization. And since from their perspective, Western civilization is almost the root of all evil, and Israel is the only Western liberal democracy that is existentially threatened and is kind of forced to defend itself. That's, I think, why all this hatred is focused on Israel. So this is perhaps
I like your quote. Let me just interrupt. I like
Yeah.
in that regard when you talk about the fact that Israel is sort of a proxy for Western civilization with its long history of, quote, imperialism, colonialism, and white supremacy. And you say Islamists and jihadists often proclaim that Israel is merely little Satan, the squire and helper of big Satan, which is, of course, the United States, which is a prototypical representative of Western civilization.
Yeah. But of course, the United States is too big an enemy to confront, right? They can't really destroy the United States. They could call it a settler colonialist regime, and of course, you can have a whole discussion about how America was colonized, and yes, of course, there are some horrible atrocities that have been committed by Europeans or by white people. That's every nation is basically born in sin. It's assholes all the way down. I'm not sure it's Scott Alexander who came up with this quote, or I forgot. But they can't get rid of the United States. That's just a complete fantasy. The United States is the most powerful country on the planet. So the only thing they can do is just like symbolic gestures like land acknowledgements, just to flaunt their virtue. But then when it comes to this single, isolated, and beleaguered country in the Middle East that is surrounded by hostile nations that are sometimes committed to wiping it off the face of the earth, and a small nation that only numbers like 10 million people, I think it's actually comparable to Belgium, the country where I live. Now, the prospect of eradicating that country from the river to the sea, globalize the Intifada, that seems just about within reach. And so that's also why I think that a lot of activist energy is going into fighting Israel, because just it's an enemy that they at least they can handle, because it's a small and relatively vulnerable. Of course, although of course it is backed up luckily by the big Satan that is standing behind it and is supporting it militarily. Otherwise, it would have been wiped off the face of the earth like a long time ago.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's a clear target, but I want to go into a little bit further into this attack on Western civilization. You say the demonization of Israel and reflexive sympathy for its genocidal enemies is not the only harmful result of this neat division of the world into perpetrators and victims. By presenting Western civilization as the root of all evil, this ideology eventually ends up with a wholesale rejection of everything Western civilization stands for: science, progress, freedom of expression, human rights, which are seen as cynical covers for imperialism and oppression. So the kind of things that you think that Western academia is all about become symbols of what's wrong rather than what's right.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's one of the harmful consequences of this ideology. So Israel is just one outgrowth of this ideology, but you can apply it to a range of different domains. And you're right. What really happens is that once you treat Western civilization as the root of all evil, then everything that was invented by Western civilization, like the scientific revolution, like the Enlightenment, like liberal democracy, is kind of tainted and is at best seen as a sort of cynical cover for ruthless exploitation and colonialism. And so ironically, these people end up with the kind of stuff that you would expect to read in their Sturme, like the Nazi magazine, or the KKK rhetoric, where they're saying that logic or linear thinking or punctuality, all these things that are valued in schools and in academic institutions, are really white kinds of thinking because they were somehow invented by white people. It's part of the Enlightenment, etc. Now, is there anything more condescending than telling black people that logic and rationality and punctuality is not really for them and they shouldn't even bother because this is whiteness? It's really almost keeping them down. It's saying it like, if you're even trying to emulate the white people and like trying to be interested in science and rationality, you're kind of betraying your roots. Or I mean, I can't really think of anything that is more obnoxious. Even though, and that's something that is really puzzling to me, that it is coming from a sort of progressive reflex. So it's a kind of stuff that you expect to read in a white nationalist magazine, but through some very roundabout, convoluted way, you can end up in that position coming from progressive premises, which is really bizarre if you think about it. But I mean, the concern for victims, for oppressed people, that's a progressive instinct that I share. I think it's good that we do that. But if you take it too far, of course, you end up with stuff like this. If you really need to divide the world into only like the oppressors who can do nothing right and the victims who can do nothing wrong, then tragically and paradoxically, you end up with straight out racist stuff.
Yeah. It is kind of interesting how that one can smoothly flow somehow into the other. It seems they should be naturally, those ideas should be naturally enemies, and they somehow merge. It's kind of interesting. A number of people talk about how it seems like an Ouroboros where the extreme left and the extreme right somehow meet somewhere. But you talk about the intellectual, more not just in general about the Western civilization, but the sort of intellectual traditions that have come, intellectual literary traditions, and you talk about first about Franz Fanon, who wrote this book, which was very influential, called The Wretched of the Earth, as one of the originators of this modern ideology. Why don't you elaborate on that a little bit? Certainly, that connection was new to me.
Yeah, And again, it is relatively new to me as well. This has been a steep learning curve for me. I was, of course, aware of Frans Fanon before the 7th of October, but I only started reading up on all this material after the 7th of October because his name just kept cropping up in all these discussions. The Wretched of the Earth is his famous book that he wrote shortly before his premature death. He died of leukemia in the early 60s, I think. So this is a psychiatrist, a black psychiatrist coming from the French island of Martinique, who ended up, after studying in Paris, in Algeria, and became a sort of honorary Algerian, and started to sympathize as a psychiatrist working in hospitals in the French colony of Algeria, treating wounded soldiers and also wounded freedom fighters, anti-colonial resistance fighters. And eventually he joined the resistance group, the FLN in Algeria. And I mean, he has a very interesting life story, but eventually at the end of his life, he writes this final condemnation of not just the French people, not just the particular atrocities that they have committed. And I mean, this is true. This is a black page in the history of France and of European colonialism in general. One of the worst episodes, I think, of decolonization, because the French really didn't want to give up their crown jewel. And he ends up writing a book that is indicting the whole of Western civilization. And that's, I think, he's not the root cause of, that would be too simplistic, of this dichotomy, but he is, I think, he looms very large over this discussion, because this division into like reducing everything to this single, like all encompassing struggle between the victims of colonization and the oppressors, that's really something that is coming straight out of Frans Fanon. And his biographer said, I forgot his name, Adam Schatz, I think. He was interviewed in an Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, I think shortly after the 7th of October. And even he had to admit that, yeah, the struggle, the 7th of October attack, if you think about it, if you apply the framework that Fanon came up with, like this ruthless and like uncompromising fights against the colonizer, in which the end justifies the means. It is a kind of Fanonian struggle. It is really inspired by the kind of stuff that I'm not sure if Fanon would have agreed with the atrocities, because I mean, he was an interesting figure, and it's, I have to say, I mean, if you read the book, it's really beautifully written. It's lyrical. I can understand why it holds so much sway, I think, over a lot of progressive minds, because he's a very fascinating character, and a very, poetic sensibility, even though it's a very violent book.
Well, speaking of violence, I was shocked. Well, I mean, it's probably my own ignorance. As someone who's enjoyed Sartre, existentialism had a big impact on me when I was younger.
Oh, interesting.
But you point out that this struggle, the Algerian struggle in particular, which was brutal and barbaric, that Sartre actually said no gentleness can efface the marks of violence. Only violence itself can destroy them. So basically, he argued that the only solution was violence, and I was surprised to see that.
Yeah, not just, violence, but really killing European. He's basically saying that if you kill a European, if a black man kills a European, you basically, what's the expression? You kill two birds with one stone. So you end up with one dead man and fewer oppressors, and you have one free man. So basically, that's the way to go. Which is, he wrote a foreword to the Wretched of the Earth. So this was basically taking Fanon's arguments to the next level. He was trying to outdo Fanon, which is, interesting in its own right, that you have this white intellectual who's sitting at the Café de Flore in Paris, engaging in this ritual self-flagellation, where he's like almost saying that he should be killed because he's complicit in this whole project of colonialism. And that's something that we also see today. So you have white people that are constantly apologizing almost for the fact that they exist and that they are complicit in the system of systemic racism. There are even people, I'm not sure, I probably deleted that footnote. There's this French intellectual who said that even Sartre didn't go far enough, because, he should have just committed suicide and just, try to...
you move from Fanon to Edward Said, who I'm more familiar with because of because of probably the debates that he had with my late friend Christopher Hitchens. But why don't you talk about Said, who's I think who changed the language? I think in terms of generation. When my parents would say Orientals, for example, and then he sort of
Yeah,
wrote a book, Orientalism, which made that a dirty word. And
exactly.
why don't you talk about Said's impact?
Yeah. Yeah, originally Orientalism was just a name for, well, on the one hand, a scientific discipline that is interested into in Eastern cultures, and also some artistic styles or schools that were influenced by the Far East. But of course, Edward Said became known for his famous book Orientalism, which turns Orientalism itself as a word into a slur, into an insult. Because basically what he's doing is he's writing about a century-old, deep ingrained desire on the part of Western civilization to oppress, to colonize, and to subjugate the East. And again, I have to give him some credit. Just like I'm always trying to be like charitable to the extent that I can. There are some interesting parts in the book, and it is. I mean, of course, if you go back a century or 2 centuries, it's not very surprising that you find very prejudiced and biased views about Eastern cultures, and that they're romanticizing these people. So there's a lot of like a mixture of fear and fascination. But of course, I mean, this happens everywhere. So it's not as if Eastern people, had completely unbiased and impartial views about Western or about Christian cultures. And what Said is doing, and from my perspective, this is a sort of continuation of what Fanon was doing, is that he's dividing the world into 2 groups. The West is the oppressor, and then the East is the victim. And this has always been like that. So basically, he projects this distinction back into history in a way that is very anachronistic, I think, where he's basically saying that like all the way back to Homer and Aristotle, this was always like the single identity of Western civilization, as if Aristotle or Homer considered themselves to be Western, that they had this desire to subjugate and to colonize the East. So it's very one-sided in the sense that one group is treated as the victim, and the other one is treated as the oppressor. And yeah, this indictment of Western civilization is extremely influential up until this day in academic circles. I mean, I'm not sure if I'd use this metaphor in the book, but it's almost I mean, attending a conference in the humanities is almost like this Mexican birthday parties where just the children take turns at whacking at this piñata until everyone gets candy. It's basically coming up with ever more inventive ways of indicting and of condemning Western civilization. And Edward Said is the kind of godfather of that sort of anti-Western tradition, I think.
No, you actually say more than that. He's the godfather of the concept of Islamophobia, which is
Yes.
which is now the buzzword. If you are at all critical, you're Islamophobic.
Yeah.
And
What was interesting about Said, he didn't really write so much about the actual imperialist practices, about the battles and the atrocities that have been committed, but about the discourse. It's about what people were writing about the East. That's also why he goes back to Homer and Aristotle, because he was analyzing their writings. And this focus, this like almost obsessive focus on discourse, on just words and stories, is something, of course, that comes from postmodernism. Somebody like Michel Foucault was a huge influence on Edward Said. And Islamophobia is an application of that idea. So rather than just talking about what Islam is actually like, I mean, is it true that they oppress women? Is it true that hatred of gay people is rampant across the Muslim world? Is it true that the penalty for apostasy is death in many Muslim countries? Rather than just talking about what actually is happening, he's talking about the way we discourse about it. So it's not so much about the actual thing, but about the way people talk about it. And Islamophobia in that way is just a way to divert the discussion and like away from what is actually happening and into just how people talk about it. And it's very easy, of course, to brush off any criticism of Islam by just saying, oh, this is just a long running Western obsession that we just like to demonize and have negative portrayals of Islam. And the question whether or not these negative views of Islam are rooted in, actual things just completely disappears out of view.
Yeah, the reality, exactly. But you also something else, which is an interesting segue to then what's been happening now. You say Said wrote next to nothing about those indigenous cultures and their own discourse of oppression, such as the caste system. So it was very selective, condemning the West, and that's carried over to what's going now. I mean, you point out, the teach outs that are happening at universities. They don't. There are no teach outs on the massacres in Sudan, Ethiopia, or Syria, because these are just subalterns killing each other. But the Palestinians in Gaza, on the other hand, can be framed as the victims of Israel. And in fact, the Houthis, are an example you bring up as very selective goggles on how one views them as either terrorists or not.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, basically nobody gave a shit about the Houthis until they started bombing American and Israeli ships. And then all of a sudden, you could hear activists and protesters chanting on the streets, what is it? Houthis, Yemen, make us proud, turn another ship around. It's basically when you divide the world up into victims and oppressors, it's always a little complicated when you see that your designated victims can also be oppressors in their own rights. They can also do horrible things. This is something that Said was completely blind to, because it was just an anomaly in his worldview. He was not interested in that. He was only interested in like the single division between the West on the one hand and the East on the other hand. And it's the same with the Houthis. So all the atrocities that the Houthis are committing, nobody really cares about that, or at least people are not protesting against it on the streets. And I mean, just to be clear, these are people that are literally throwing gays off buildings that are or amputating the limbs of thieves and like all these traditional Sharia punishments. This is a jihadist death cult, just like Hamas is. And so on the one hand, if it's just subalterns killing each other, people don't care. It's just they don't really fit within the framework of victims versus oppressors until they start attacking the real oppressor, and then by automatically they become a victim and they become a group that you should support, because there's only one battle waging in the world, and it's between the West and the rest. And if you have these Houthis that are attacking Western ships and Israeli ships, then you have to support them, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Well, yes. Once again, you say by openly abandoning Enlightenment universalism in this way, progressives have become the allies of religious reactionaries and fanatics in non-Western cultures. I mean, I don't know if you want to elaborate any more on that. You've made the point, but is there anything else you want to say about it, or?
Yeah, I think it's even apart from the Houthis, this is a pretty extreme example. Of course, I mean, I wouldn't say that most activists are probably hopefully educated enough to know that the Houthis is not a group that they would probably gladly execute them if they could, especially the queers or the gays. But I do think that even someone like Edward Said, who I think was much more sophisticated and interesting, but still his kind of rhetoric against Orientalism was really a gift to the Ayatollahs and the Muftis in the world that are trying to purge their society from Western influences. Because basically what he was saying is that Western influences are evil because they just want to oppress and colonize us. He didn't intend to have that kind of effect, of course, because I mean he was an educated man. He was also like biographically he was straddling a little bit between the East and the West. He comes from he was born in Palestine, but he's also had he had an American father. But that was really the effect that his writings had. That it was just much easier for religious fundamentalists to basically vilify any sort of Western influence, including secularism and science and all these things that we hold dear.
Okay, and I think the seriousness of this situation is contrasted, as you described, by the same ideological trends tend to end up resulting in these trivial examples, these silly examples of inclusive language. The New Zealand requirement to have indigenous knowledge be granted equal status, the Yale ridiculous controversy over Halloween costumes, and by the way, Nicholas Christakis, who is the subject of that, is one of the people who writes in the book, and Lancet describing women as bodies with vagina. It's almost, as you point out, it's almost humorous to see those inanities.
It is humorous, and that's probably also why I underestimated it, because it's just so silly that it seems like, I mean, do you really expect me to take this stuff seriously? That's what I thought for a long time, and even now, I'm often willing, like, to just to give them what they want. Sometimes I just like just to to get rid of them. Whatever. I mean, you want me to use different pronouns? Fine. I mean, that's also a matter of courtesy. Or you want me to say, like in Dutch, we have a discussion that you shouldn't say we have blanc and wet. So we kind of have two words for white people. And now, of course, whichever is the word that we're using, you're not allowed to say that anymore. Now we have to switch words. Like, okay, whatever. I mean, if sometimes just to get rid of them, I'm almost inclined to just to go along with what they want. So it took me a while to realize that this also has serious consequences, because it's I mean, the kind of woke stuff that ends up in the newspaper about about blackfacing, or about inappropriate words or slurs about or microaggressions. If you asking somebody where he's from, for example, you're not allowed to say that anymore. It's easy to ridicule that, and rightly so. I mean, a lot of the stuff is ridiculous, but unfortunately, it can also lead to more serious consequences.
Well, in fact, as you say, it's all well for privileged students at universities to wallow in decolonization, offensive language, because nothing much is at stake. But I think it's, and you say it's empty posturing, but when it comes to the conflict in Gaza, there actually is serious things at stake. It's not just talking about language; it's people's lives in every way, both sides of the conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I should mention this. I mean, we're of course recording this as the war in Gaza is still raging. I mean, it is absolutely horrific, and I think we also shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking of seeing only one part of the conflict as the real victim. Of course, I mean, both of them are victims.
It's a tragedy in every way.
Absolutely. Yes. So of course, and hopefully by the time this is released, and the war will have ended. But who knows? But I do think, yes. When people are dying, when terrorists commit atrocities, and then also in retaliation when Israel strikes back, then something is really at stake. And we can have an argument about Netanyahu and about the far right politicians in Israel's coalitions, who are not my friends by any stretch. But I still think that Israel is a liberal democracy, and I still think it is worth defending against its totalitarian enemies.
Yes. Okay. And I want to read your final paragraph. In the wake of October 7th, it's become abundantly clear what kind of moral monstrosities you end up with if you start dividing the world into evil oppressors and noble victims. If elite universities want to stem the rapidly dwindling trust in academic institutions, they need to consistently apply free speech principles and adopt institutional neutrality across the board. Something we'll talk about with a number of people in this book. And they need to tackle the ideological rot that they have allowed to spread and even cultivated for decades, mostly in the form of the massive DEI bureaucracy. The last thing they should do is abet and give cover for this pernicious ideology in U.S. Congress for the eyes of the world to see. Right, so I think if we talk about what to do next, I think that's a that's an important call for action. So
yeah, and perhaps the last point I should make in that respect is, I mean, I know this book is probably gonna get a lot of pushback from people who are saying, like, is this the real threat? I mean, the war in science, you're really talking about the wokies now. But these things are not unrelated, and I'm freely admitting that, of course, when we were writing the book, Trump had not been reelected yet. When I was writing my chapter, I didn't know that yet. Yes, of course, at this moment, Trump is a more serious threat to academic freedom, but it is an external threat. First of all, I mean, the kind of stuff that we're talking about here is like emerging from within academia, and it's feeding off each other. So that's exactly why I end the piece in that way. Like the last thing they should do is to give cover and to abet this kind of moral monstrosities, because what will happen eventually is that you're gonna get a huge backlash from society, and basically, the president in this case, like is basically declaring war on Harvard, pretending to using anti-Semitism as a sort of excuse. I'm not sure if they really care about anti-Semitism this much, but I mean, Harvard really had it coming. I mean, they could have avoided all of this stuff by being more reasonable and by not abetting this pernicious ideology. So I do think that there's wars waging on different fronts. But we have to just do our part to prevent this kind of backlash from happening. I mean, also in Europe is not that bad yet. But if we don't like mend our ways, then we're gonna get exactly the same thing in Europe. We're also gonna get something like Trumpism or the election of some far right leader.
First of all, I'm really glad you brought this up, and you're right. It's an issue that we're gonna have to be discussing a lot when this book comes out. 30 people are going to say, well, there's a real war. And you said it exactly right. One's external, one's internal. And the external you fight in the ballot box and in other places. Internal is a cultural thing, and it takes longer to do it. But as you speak, it occurred to me that there's also another analogy. Many people had warned Israel along that what was going on in Gaza, the way that being treated would not only result in counterreactions, but produce sympathies around the world that might result in extremism. And so you see, the same kind of, you see then the result being the horrific attack by Hamas, and you give cover to that by saying, well, Israel's not been particularly good in Gaza. And then, and you're seeing it in a different sense. You're giving cover for these extremists, anti-free speech, anti-open inquiry people like Trump and his minions, and you're giving cover to them by not having addressed the problem that's going on in academia right now, which is what we're talking about. And so I'm hoping that by having people like you and my other colleagues who've written in the book, that we can try and address this problem before more extreme versions happening. I just saw today, for example, just as we speak, it'll be old news by the time this is out, that the newest attack in the last hour of the Trump administration on Harvard has now stopped their ability to have foreign scholars and international students come to the university, which is death of the university if it really happened.
No, absolutely, and that's really serious. And Harvard is completely right. I'm on Harvard's side now. Ironically, of course, I was extremely upset when the whole thing, the whole episodes that I described in the chapter happened. We have to clean out our own stables, and if we're not gonna do it, if right thinking, right thinking, not ideologically right thinking, but just reasonable, progressive people, I would say, don't seriously tackle this problem, then we're basically, almost inviting someone like Trump to do it, and then of course it's going to be much more brutal than the way. I mean, we're just trying to have a reasonable discussion. I'm willing to engage in arguments also with people who believe that Fanon and Edward Said were very important and thinkers. Trump, of course, is not interested in any of that. He's just interested in owning the libs and just basically destroying every institution that is captured by the liberals. I mean, rightly or wrongly.
Well, thank you for this discussion, which has been illuminating. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you, and I appreciate you taking the time to.
Likewise. Thanks for having me
to talk about this, and your very informative contribution, which was great. Thanks again.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Hi, it's Lawrence again. As the Origins podcast continues to reach millions of people around the world, I just wanted to say thank you. It's because of your support, whether you listen or watch, that we're able to help enrich the perspective of listeners by providing access to the people and ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world and driving the future of our society in the 21st century. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also leave us private feedback on our website if you'd like to see any parts of the podcast improved. Finally, if you'd like to access ad-free and bonus content, become a paid subscriber at origensproject.org. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation as a non-profit effort committed to enhancing public literacy and engagement with the world by connecting science and culture. You can learn more about our events, our travel excursions, and ways to get involved at origensproject.org. Thank you.